So it's all
All
right
right,
to go.
be going.
All right. Thank you so much. We are going to look at the Johannine component of historical Jesus research, because again, sometimes people just exclude the Gospel of John from historical Jesus research, and yet we have good reason to take John into account. And if John were the only gospel we had, or if John and Mark were the only gospels we had, we would probably take John very seriously. But because Matthew and Luke follow Mark, we sometimes think, well, John's no good. John is quite different from Mark, and we'll look at that. But if you take John just from the points that we can verify externally, apart from the Gospels, like geography or names, there's a lot of material there to look at. So, for example, the topography of the Holy Land. John knows it very well. Cana and Bethsaida are near Capernaum, just like, sorry for the typo, just like Chorazin in the Q material in Matthew 11 and Luke 10. Capernaum and Bethsaida were lakeside towns that involved the fish industry. All that is verifiable from other extra biblical sources. Tiberias, which appears in John chapter 6, because some boats come from Tiberias, and the lake of Tiberias, which is the lake of Galilee, which is the lake of Gennesaret. Tiberias was a major center on the lake of Galilee. Of course, we know more about it than that, but that by itself is sufficient to get our attention. And also, let's see. Also, Bethany was about 2 miles from Jerusalem, John chapter 11. That fits both what we know of Bethany from external sources, including archaeology, provided we have the right village, and it's pretty sure that we do. And it also fits exactly what John says, that it's about 2 miles from Galilee. Samaria's Sychar and Jacob's well in that location. And this mountain, although it's not formally identified by name, Mount Gerizim, but John's gospel mentions these sites, and we know of them from archaeological sources and from Josephus and so on. Sychar is probably the village of Asgar. John also knows sites that are not securely known to us today. Bethany beyond the Jordan, unless that's a symbolic reference, but Perean Bethany, we don't really know where that is. Enon near Salim, we don't know where that is. I used to attend a very nice church named Enon, named after this Enon in John 3:23, but we don't really know where it was. And Cana is within visual view of Nazareth, which was near Sepphoris. So a lot of these things were within visual views, within walking distance, at least if you left a few hours to get there. And here is just a picture of some of the excavations at the likely site, Khirbet Cana, which is different from the Kefir Cana, which was the traditional site for the wedding in John 2. But Khirbet Cana is usually agreed upon today. Here you can see Sychar, well, the remains of Sychar. Tiberias, this is an older picture, obviously not first century, but like pre-current time. Here are some of the excavations at Bethany from the north. Some of the ruins of Bethany. Again, ruins of Bethany. And you can see that Bethany is not too far from where the Temple Mount was. A couple miles. You'd go from Bethany to Bethphage. Again, if we have the right site, that's where Jesus got the donkey. Well, in John, Jesus got the donkey. In the Synoptics, his disciples got the donkey. But saying that Jesus got the donkey is just a short way, concise way of saying the same way that you have people saying that so-and-so wrote something in the Bible, or so-and-so did something, meaning they commissioned it to be done. Joseph of Arimathea probably didn't roll the stone by himself or carry the body by himself. He probably had people working with him to do it, but it's under his supervision, so he gets the name. So anyway, Bethany, Bethphage, and then at least another mile to the gates of Jerusalem. Now, John knows Jerusalem really, really well. Some people say, the author must have been a Jerusalemite. That would still fit John of Galilee, the fourth, well, the beloved, if the beloved disciple happens to be John, like some of us think, that would still fit him because, I mean, you look at Galatians chapter 2 and you find out that James, the brother of Jesus, and John and Peter were leaders in the Jerusalem church in the late 40s or early 50s. I would say probably early 50s, but whenever Galatians was written, it also fits what we have in the book of Acts, where they settled there and remained in leadership in Jerusalem for, well, yeah, at least into the early 50s. They may have been not there when Paul visited James and the elders around the year 60 or 62. But for decades, John had plenty of experience in Jerusalem, so he would have known Jerusalem very well. But whoever the author was, the author knows Jerusalem very well, even though, according to the usual dating of John's gospel, John is writing perhaps 25 years after the temple's and Jerusalem's destruction. Archaeology confirms his reports. For example, the Pool of Bethesda, which is probably under St. Anne's Monastery, they excavated there. They found the twin pools with 5 porticos. That is, there's one on each of the 4 sides, and then one running down the middle, separated into 2 pools, twin pools. Also, the Pool of Siloam. Now, everybody knew there was such a thing, but recent discoveries have uncovered its massiveness to the extent that many people think today that it was used for ritual immersions before entering the Temple Mount. I don't know how they did co-ed ritual immersions, which had to be done naked in a way that guarded, especially because you could look down from certain places in the city. I'm not sure how they would have done that, but some of those things are still being discussed. The pools of Bethesda would be here, with the red roof, not the red roof in here, but this is the pools of Bethesda. Actually used to have water in them. You can see that they're not far from the temple, which is also true for the Pool of Siloam. Here again are the pools of Bethesda on the Jerusalem model. And here is where it would have been located, in terms of the modern layout of Jerusalem. The pools of Bethesda by St. Anne's Church. Here you can see some of it. Not all of it is visible. And of course, there are different layers from different periods coming afterwards. But you can see the steps leading down into this massive pool that's mentioned in John chapter 5. And here you can see the Pool of Bethesda and the Asclepium area. Now, the reason we speak of it is speak of those together. Later, in maybe a century or a couple centuries later, there was an Asclepium on the site of Bethesda Pool. And normally, people would reuse holy sites for other things. So the fact that they made an Asclepium, which was a healing shrine, on the site of the Pool of Bethesda suggests a tradition going back that this was associated with healing. Now, they're probably not getting that from Christian tradition, given the fact that this is pagan. they're probably getting that from the existing Jewish tradition that had been there on the site of this is a place for healing. So fitting what we have in John chapter 5, an external corroboration about John's knowledge of the use of the site. This is the pools of Bethesda closer up on a model of Jerusalem in a later period, again, twin pools. The Byzantine period was Christian leadership in the area. Here are excavations from the pool of Siloam. And you can see, again, steps leading down into this. There would be landings. The level of the pool wouldn't always be exactly the same depending on the rains and so on. But people would step down into these the way they would step down into immersion pools. And then you could dunk yourself. The pool actually goes a lot further than this, but this is private property, privately owned, can't be excavated at this point. Here are steps from the pool of Siloam. So, you know, when we read about the blind man who goes to the pool of Siloam, washes, and comes back healed, John chapter 5, this is the actual site where it happened. On the Jerusalem model, you can see the pool of Siloam and its proximity to the upper city and the Temple Mount. When we look at John's narratives, one of my professors, actually my dissertation advisor, D. Moody Smith, who was a major Johannine scholar of the last generation, he pointed out that the narratives in John are surprisingly synoptic-like. That is, the main differences that you have between John and the synoptics, besides arrangement, and you have some details in the narrative too, but in terms of what we expect from Jesus, the narratives, by the criterion of coherence, really fit very closely with the synoptics. Same kind of Jesus, acting in the same kind of ways towards people, healing people, doing nature miracles, and so forth. We have those both in John and the synoptics. The differences are more his Christological expositions at points and the more lengthy speeches. That may be more of a stylistic difference, but when we look at the narratives, we see a lot of coherence. So only some of these are multiply attested, which suggests that if John knows the synoptics, they're not his only source. That is, he's literarily independent. And when I say literarily independent, that doesn't mean he doesn't know that the synoptics existed. It means that he doesn't have them in front of him. He's not trying to follow them deliberately. It's, you know, these are maybe one of many sources. And he does claim eyewitness material in this gospel. There are a few places where he speaks of the beloved disciple, most explicitly in chapters 13, 19, 20, and 21. The majority of Johannine scholars, at least as of the end of the 20th century, it's shifted some, but I don't know if it's shifted to a majority at this point. The majority of Johannine scholars in the late 20th century, at least, and through most of the 20th century, didn't think John 21 was part of the original gospel because it's anticlimactic. The differences in vocabulary, though, aren't very significant. The differences in vocabulary seem to be primarily differences in terms of the topics that are covered. So linguistically, it looks fairly Johannine, but it's anticlimactic. But my response to that has always been, well, book 24 of the Iliad, the conclusion of the Iliad is anticlimactic. It's not uncommon to find, a climax, and then the narrative has an anticlimactic conclusion afterwards. You have that on the Lord of the Rings whole series. It's after they rescue everything, it's anticlimactic. Well, the Iliad was the most widely read book in Mediterranean antiquity. So if that could be anticlimactic in the ending, there's no reason why John couldn't have an anticlimactic ending as well. Um, but John's gospel does claim to be dependent on an eyewitness, namely the beloved disciple. Now, there are a lot of variations in ancient bioi. And I should mention, by the way, that most, we talked earlier about the genre of ancient bioi, the genre of ancient biography, and looking at the historiographic implications of that genre. That's important if you are thinking in terms of what we know from typical biographies from the period of the early Roman Empire. But having said that, not everybody has a consensus at this point on the historiographic character of ancient biography. In fact, don't be surprised by this, but most people have never read ancient biographies. So you have to look at not just what people say about them. Again, there was one article some years ago by a really good scholar, but he gave 4 examples of ancient biographies, all of which, I mean, not all, well, most of them are not from the right period, but all of which were really novels rather than ancient biographies. It's a little bit different in genre, but he called them ancient biographies. So he was trying to make a literary comparison, but it just, we can make closer literary comparisons with works that actually are ancient biographies about genuine historical figures, especially those who lived in recent times. But if we look at what people could do with ancient biographies, there is a range. So, for example, including from the early Roman Empire, Philo's Life of Moses adapts and expands some speeches from the Pentateuch. Josephus actually adds speeches for Moses. So does Philo. Philo has three new speeches for Moses. Historians often used speeches to provide perspectives and interpretation. Now, biographers, they want to catch the character of the person. It works best if you know something that the person actually said, but John may be giving more explanatory paraphrases and not just, verbatim, Jesus said it exactly this way. So we have some sayings of Jesus in John's gospel that also appear in the synoptics, but when they appear in John, they appear in his own style, which actually, according to ancient standards, was considered preferable to just cribbing the style of your predecessor. So John is actually more literarily appropriate in that sense than are, say, Matthew and Luke, but where they use Mark. Xenophon's Memoirs of Socrates. Now, this is not from the early Roman Empire. This is from centuries earlier, maybe sort of proto-biography. But here we have an example of a first-hand witness, yet he frames his master's teaching in lengthy speech material. It's not that Socrates said all these things on one occasion. Nobody says Socrates said all these things verbatim, but he's giving you the sense this is Socrates' teaching. And we may have some of that in John's gospel. Dialogues were used as a literary frame for teaching in ancient literature. Usually, though, when people did that, like Plato, and it was still being done, Cicero would make fictitious dialogues. We know they're fictitious because, for example, Cicero says to somebody, oh, I'm going to write some dialogues and I'm going to make you a character in them. So, you'd want to make them in character, but those were works that were entirely dialogues rather than biographies per se. So John may have some literary freedom. He may be on the more adaptive end of ancient biography than some other ancient biographers, more than the Gospels, but also not more than some of the other ones. Now, also with ancient biographies, even those who were written by somebody who knew them, sometimes we have as little as less than 10%, sometimes less than 5% of that material can be independently attested from other surviving sources. T. Wright, who was my former TA, it was really convenient. If I forget his name, I just remember the first initial of TA. But anyway, T. Wright did his dissertation on biographies by biographers who actually knew their subjects in antiquity. And the fact that you can't independently attest all the material doesn't mean we have reason to be skeptical of all that material, because these were people who actually knew the biography. And again, if the fourth gospel is telling the truth, if it's not lying, it's not deliberately misrepresenting the idea that the beloved disciple is a witness, then we have eyewitness material in the fourth gospel. Now, there are differences between John and the synoptics, and these are explained in different ways by different scholars. As I worked through the Gospel of John, I found these especially in the Passion material. Now, I wanted to write my commentary on John, especially with a view to its literary and theological message. And, to put that in its first century context, to understand the background. I wasn't primarily looking at it for his historical Jesus considerations. But having said that, as I worked through it, I was able to make comparisons with other material, including material in the synoptics, because that's just part of what you're supposed to do as a commentator, unless you define your commentary writing in a more narrow way, which some scholars do. But if you're trying to write a general commentary on it, scholars usually want to know, well, what may be behind this? Where did this author get this information? And since John seems to be an ancient biography, and since ancient biographies meant to tell you something about their subject, I mean, that was their most important issue in a biography, then it makes sense to actually test that out. So I did make comparisons with the synoptics, and I found the differences were particularly in the Passion material, which seems it might seem kind of counterintuitive at first, because the Passion material would be what everybody knew. At the Lord's Supper, you have a basic outline of the Passion narrative being recited in a very concise form by Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 through 26 or so. So probably a lot of the Passion material was already known. And yet that's where John differs from the synoptics to the greatest extent. Now, we can explain some differences between John and the synoptics. John saying, okay, well, that may be Peter's memory, but this is my memory. I'm going to give you my account. But on the other hand, some of it looks like it's almost deliberately tweaking it, which is what a good storyteller will sometimes do. Now, a good storyteller telling a true story can't tweak it quite the same way that a storyteller telling a fictitious story will. So, for example, if I tell Jack and the Beanstalk, I may tweak it to the point where Jack is chopping down this beanstalk, and the beanstalk comes with the giant on top of it, and bam, sorry if that was too loud, squishes Jack. And immediately the children would say, no, that's not how it ends. So I can't even get away with that too much in a fictitious story if the kids already know the story. But with a true story, I mean, you've got to stay with the true storyline. But you can tell it in different ways, different times, building suspense, getting people's attention, like they're expecting this to happen. You say, this happened. They didn't know about that part. So that may be part of what John is doing as well. But in any case, what we can see with many of these differences in the Passion narrative, it shows that Jesus remains in control. He's laying down his life. No one takes it from him. So here are some of the differences in this overlapping passion material. The Last Supper in the Synoptics, it's a Passover meal. It explains Jesus' death. But in John's Gospel, while there is a Last Supper, they go on to find out that Jesus is the Passover lamb. It's shown in a more explicit way, a more theologically explicit way. The woman in Bethany anoints Jesus' head in Mark and in Matthew, but in John, the woman in Bethany anoints Jesus's feet, which prepares well for Jesus washing his disciples' feet in chapter 13. He takes over the model that she gave, a model of servanthood and respect and love. Jesus then gives that to his disciples. In Mark 11, Jesus' disciples find the donkey. In John 12, Jesus finds the donkey. In Mark 14, Judas dips the piece of bread. In John 13, Jesus gives Judas the dipped piece of bread. In Mark 15:34, it emphasizes the Father abandoning Jesus. John 16:32 says, as Jesus is getting ready to go to the cross, you're all going to abandon me, but the Father will be with me. He's not going to leave me. It's emphasizing a different side of what happened. Now, did Jesus, it doesn't have to be contradictory. It can be complementary, but it's different. Jesus cries in Gethsemane in Mark 14:36, Abba, Father, please take this cup from me, but not my will, but yours be done. But what we have in John 17, it focuses on Jesus' prayer for his disciples. Now, John does know that Jesus prayed for the Father to take that cup from him. I mean, you have a prayer like that back in John 12. And the prayer in Gethsemane also, knowledge of that seems to appear in Hebrews chapter 5. So this is a widespread tradition, especially when you have Mark using the Aramaic and this being picked up by the early church, Romans 8, Galatians 4, widely known tradition about the Abba prayer. But John is going to emphasize a different side of it. So in Mark, please remove this cup. In John 18, when the people come to arrest him, Jesus is now committed to drink the Father's cup. Again, that's not a contradiction, but it's certainly, they're emphasizing different points. Now, this part isn't in Mark, but just noting how John arranges his material. Jesus is both captured and crucified in gardens. That topographically frames the passion narrative. Judas identifies Jesus with a kiss in Mark. In John, and I don't know if I pointed out this difference in my John commentary. Some of the stuff you think of after you finish writing, but I did notice that John didn't include the kiss. I was kind of disappointed, like I wanted to comment on that. But in John, it doesn't take Judas to identify Jesus. Jesus just says, whom do you seek? And then he identifies himself. And they fall backwards because of, I guess, the glory of his presence. You have a similar tradition, I believe in Artapanus, where Moses whispers the holy name of God into the ears of Pharaoh, and he falls over. But you also have people being overwhelmed by the Spirit, like in 1 Samuel 19, and falling over. And we have accounts of that happening in modern revival history. Most of the Great Awakenings, you had people falling over as they get overwhelmed by the presence of God. So, but that's something that John would emphasize, emphasizing Jesus is the Lord in the flesh. Mark wants to emphasize more Jesus' brokenness. And if you're also taking the Mark class besides the historical Jesus class, you'll see how that's a big emphasis in Mark. It's not just John who has an emphasis. Mark has an emphasis too. Simon in Mark's gospel carries Jesus' cross. In John's gospel, Jesus carries his cross. By the way, in terms of ancient expectations, it was more customary for the condemned person to carry their own cross rather than for somebody else to carry it for them. The way this is often put together is that Jesus was too weak after the beating. He starts carrying it at the beginning. He can't carry it all the way. But you can see the respective emphases of the different authors. So Simon carries Jesus' cross in Mark. That highlights where Jesus said, if you really want to be my disciple, you take up your cross and follow me. And guess what? The disciples don't do it. But in John, remember, Jesus says, I lay down my life of my own accord. No one takes it from me. Jesus's final recorded cry in Mark 15 sounds devastated. But Jesus' final recorded cry in John sounds triumphant rather than pitiful. Now, he could have said both things. They weren't both his final cry, but they give us different sides of Jesus' experience in the cross. And both fit the emphasis of the picture that Mark and John are giving us. And yet there's substantial overlap in how they tell us about Jesus. So, for example, in both the synoptics and in John, Jesus comes from Nazareth in Galilee. In both the synoptics and John, Jesus is known as the son of Joseph, although Joseph, unlike Jesus' mother, appears nowhere during the narratives of Jesus' ministry. But this is something that both sources knew. Interestingly, John's gospel never names Jesus' mother, just calls her Jesus' mother, even though she has a big acting role in the gospel. She's not named, but presumably people knew her name. John's proclamation, John the Baptist's proclamation, John shows that he's not the Messiah. You have that both in Luke and in John, very similar in both cases. John prepares the way for the Lord in the wilderness in the language of Isaiah. You have that in Mark, followed by Matthew and Luke. Luke gives you a little longer quotation. You also have it in John. In John's gospel, the fourth gospel, you have John the Baptist actually saying that. Could the idea have actually originated from John, this idea we have in the other gospels? Why not? Look where John is hanging out. He's hanging out in the wilderness. Well, we know from Qumran that the Qumran sectarians took that passage about the voice of one crying in the wilderness and applied it to their own ministry. So we know that there were first century Judeans living in the wilderness who applied that to their ministry. There's no reason to doubt that for John the Baptist as well. John proclaims the one coming after him, the thong of whose sandals John is not worthy to release. Again, you have that in both. John baptizes merely in water, but one is coming who's greater than he is. He's going to baptize in the Holy Spirit. And that ties into the theme of ritual purification, both in Mark and in John, although that's more of a literary observation than a historical observation, because that's showing what the authors do with it. Although, going back to Jesus' ministry, it makes sense as well. John recognizes that the Spirit descends on Jesus like a dove. And again, you have Mark recording that. In different settings, a heavenly voice attests Jesus. And Jesus is thus shown to be God's Son in both kinds of sources. Key disciples were already known to the audience. So when the writer starts talking about them, the writer doesn't have to introduce them as fully because there's an assumption that the audience has already heard of them. So this is pre-Mark and pre-Johannine material. And the examples I'm giving here, though, in terms of already being known to the audience, I'm especially thinking in terms of John's gospel. But Simon and Andrew, Philip, Thomas, Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him, another Judas. And you also find that some of the disciples were experienced in fishing, apparently along with the sons of Zebedee. And that makes sense historically when Capernaum and Bethsaida were fishing villages. Some of their actions, Jesus names Simon as Peter. Now, you have that at a different place in John and in Matthew. If we were just looking at Mark, we might think that happens when he's calling the 12 to follow him. But Mark isn't really that specific about the timing. But Jesus nicknames Simon as Peter. Jesus' actions in the temple are clearly attested in both. Jesus overturns tables in the temple. He drives out money changers and sellers of doves. He quotes scripture, although the scripture texts that are quoted are different in Mark 11:17 and in John chapter 2. But he didn't drive all these people out in just a few seconds. I mean, it would have taken him a few minutes. He had time to say more than one thing. Having said that he had a few minutes, he probably didn't have a few hours to do this, because temple police probably would have intervened if it had gone on that long. But at least we know, he had some time. He probably didn't say just one thing during that time. He probably was saying a few things. Jesus is reported as speaking of raising up the temple in 3 days after it's destroyed. Now, it was interpreted in quite different ways by friend and foe. In Mark, it's quoted by his foes, so it's distorted. You have something similar to that in Acts chapter 6. But in John chapter 2, we have it in a more plausible way directly from Jesus. Jesus feeds the 5,000 in the countryside. We have that both in Mark and in John. We actually have that in all four Gospels, although the feeding the 4,000 is not in all four Gospels, but the 5,000 is. There are just 5 loaves and 2 fish. Jesus has the people sit down. There are about 5,000 people. Jesus gives thanks, then distributes the food for all. And after the miracles, they gather 12 baskets of leftovers. So again, not saying that John had never read the other Gospels or heard the other Gospels, more likely. But certainly Mark, he would have to have known of Mark if Mark was circulating when we think Mark was. I think he probably would have had to have known of Matthew, and he probably met Luke at some point. But this is all based on my reconstruction. It's not something everybody would agree upon. But having said that, as I said earlier, I think John is literarily independent. And what that suggests is that, that John highlights these things. He has these details, working probably from memory, not with something in front of him, makes this something like multiple attestation. Not quite the same way we would take Mark and Q for those of us who believe in it, but at least something like multiple attestation. Jesus comes to the disciples walking on the Lake of Galilee. The disciples are crossing the lake to the west. We have that in both, although in Mark it's to Bethsaida, in John it's to Capernaum. The wind is stirring the lake and slowing their crossing. Jesus comes to them walking on the lake. They're scared. Actually, I think that even if Mark and John hadn't told us that, and even if we didn't know about the disciples sometimes lacking courage, personally, I think we would probably infer they probably were scared. But anyway, Jesus assures them, "It is I," in the Greek words, ego eimi, I am, and tells them not to be scared. And then Jesus joins them in the boat. Peter confesses Jesus' identity as the Messiah or as the Holy One of God. Now, again, you've got differences. I'm not elaborating on all the differences because some of the differences are like one source of silence about something the other one includes. And I think with any source, I mean, if we don't start with the premise that this source is unreliable until proven reliable, but we say, well, let's give it the benefit of the doubt, or at least say, well, we don't know either way. We're not going to screen out those things that one has that's not in the other. Again, people who actually knew the people about whom they wrote, a lot of their stuff is not independently verifiable in sources that still survive today. This stuff was 2,000 years ago. We don't have a whole lot of sources that have survived, but we do have enough to show substantial overlap. The priestly aristocrats, Annas and Caiaphas, are among the high priests. This is stated even more precisely than in Acts chapter 4 and verse 6, because Caiaphas, John keeps saying he's the high priest that year, whereas Mark doesn't really name them, but Mark calls a whole bunch of them high priests. So does Josephus, although he does name them. Acts, you expect Luke to be very precise. Those of you who will be taking my Acts course, I'll give you more reasons for believing that even next semester. But Caiaphas is not just one of the high priests. He's not just a member of the high priestly family along with Annas. He's the current high priest. So John is very precise in saying that. Sometimes people criticize him as saying that, like, oh, you think that high priests held that office only for 1 year, like some Greek priesthoods. Come on. If you know anything about John's gospel and the Old Testament, John knew the Old Testament. John knew better than that. But in any case, some leading aristocratic priests and others plot to arrest and kill Jesus with a concern for public order. You have that mentioned in both. Of course, both are behind the scenes. You can figure it out pretty well, though, from what they do publicly afterwards. Jesus' final time in Jerusalem is for Passover, and he orchestrates for that. In Mark's gospel as well as in John's gospel, Jesus answers certain things evasively to make sure he gets crucified at the right time, not before his hour has come. So Jesus' final time in Jerusalem is for Passover. John lets us know it's not his first Passover. Well, actually, Luke lets us know that too, because Jesus was there as a boy. As a normal Galilean, Jesus probably was there regularly for Passovers, but he didn't get crucified every Passover. He gets crucified on one Passover season. It happens in the vicinity of Jerusalem that Jesus lodges at Bethany. You were supposed to lodge within the city limits when you actually partook of the Passover. Jesus is lodging at Bethany. We know that he has friends there. Friends of Jesus include the sisters Martha and Mary. We know that from Luke's gospel, which again, it's very unlikely John had that in front of him. I think actually Luke probably knew that from what we call Johannine tradition, or the material that we now have in John. They probably got from John or from people, not John's gospel, but from the beloved disciples material. But anyway, all of that is debated. All those relationships among the gospels are debated, and especially when we come to John's gospel. An anointing of Jesus happens early in the Passion narrative. Jesus is dining in Bethany when it happens. A woman anoints him with aromatic nard. Now, John's the only one who identifies this as Mary who does it, but 3 of the Gospels tell us about this anointing. We have another earlier anointing in Luke 7, which I think is a different anointing, and we have some maybe some conflation of details between them, like whether it was the feet or the head. Although if you're lying down in the normal posture you would be at a banquet, the feet aren't really that far from the head. I mean, if you can reach the feet, coming over to the head, or actually starting with the head, coming to the feet, wouldn't be a problem. So we have difference of emphasis, but conflating details, writers do it all the time. When you have to leave out a scene because you don't have enough space. I mean, in Impossible Love, sometimes we had to do this. It's a true story. Everything in it happened. Impossible Love, if anybody forgot, that's the story, or if you're watching this later, it's the story of my wife and me, how we got together, and her experience as a war refugee is the most adventurous and moving part of the book. But there were some places where we had to leave out certain things, and we didn't want to leave out everything So like something that the Lord spoke on one occasion, we had to leave out the occasion. So we might import that to a different occasion because for space reasons, we couldn't record it when it happened. We tag it onto something else the Lord said in another setting. Sometimes we didn't actually remember who said what, although usually the Gospels just leave that blank. They don't mention who said what if they don't know. I mean, Peter, he can usually know that he said what. I'm taking the view that Peter was Mark's main source. Again, that's very debated today, but I have come to the view, I was like tossing it around for a while, but I really come to that as my view. I'll deal with that more in my Mark commentary, but I haven't had time to write that yet. So, but a woman anoints him with aromatic nard. Bystanders, this ointment could have been sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor. Apparently that stuck out to people. They remember that. Jesus defends her. Let her alone. You always have the poor with you, but you don't always have me. Same lines in both. And Jesus associates the anointing with his burial in both. So that one's really close. The on those details. The triumphal entry, Jesus obtains a colt. In Mark, he does it through the disciples. John just summarizes as Jesus obtains a colt. Many throw branches on the road where Jesus is coming. Again, John gives us some details that Mark doesn't, but both of them have that substance. The crowd shout a line from Psalm 118, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the Lord's name. And that also fits the historical context, which is something a diaspora audience might well not know, but it fits the Passover Hallel, the Psalms that were sung during the Passover season, Psalms 113 through 118. Well, this is from Psalm 118. Jesus is the foundation stone of a new temple. Seems to be implied in Mark chapter 12 and verse 10 with the citation from Psalm 100, different citation from Psalm 118, but it's also in John chapter 7, verses 37 to 39. And I won't go into detail on that as much as I'd love to, but just to say that actually fits also its context at the Festival of Tabernacles, even though at the time John is writing, the temple, or he's probably writing, when most of us think he's writing is like in the 90s, probably writing that close to a quarter of a century after the temple was destroyed. So this is a memory that goes back to before the temple was destroyed. It's something that most of John's audience probably wouldn't pick up on unless they were old enough to have made pilgrimage to the temple at some point, or they were, there were a number of Jewish refugees from Judea, probably already in Asia Minor at this point, where many of us think that John was writing. But that fits the historical context very well also. Servanthood in the Last Supper context. Jesus teaches about servanthood in the Last Supper context and uses himself as an example. He does that verbally in Luke chapter 22. He does it verbally, also washing the disciples' feet in John chapter 13. Jesus predicts the betrayal and also Peter's denials. The disciples wonder who he means by the betrayal. Jesus predicts that his followers will abandon him and be scattered. Peter insists that he's going to follow no matter what, and Jesus predicts Peter's denials. Jesus and his disciples leave the place where they've dined and they go to the countryside. Satan enters Judas Iscariot, who has pecuniary motives, and Judas betrays Jesus. One disciple strikes off the ear of the high priest's slave with a sword. John adds the name Malchus, but contrary to what Bultmann thought, names don't always get added in later tradition. I mean, Matthew leaves out Jairus's name that you have in Mark. So they can be added, they can be removed. When they're added, you don't always know where they're added from. It could be from the person's memory or from another source. So in any case, um, the striking off the ear of the high priest's slave earns Jesus reproof, specifically put your sword back in its place. Again, this is a parallel between Matthew and John. These are things I didn't pay that much attention to when I was writing my John commentary, like piling them all up. They were things that very much fascinated my dissertation mentor, D. Moody Smith, seeing how these were signs of historical tradition. I mean, Matthew and John are almost certainly literarily independent, but there are times when they overlap in their substance in ways that would be rather surprising if you're thinking that either of them is just having a free hand and just making these things up. And Jesus must drink the Father's cup. Jesus stands before the high priest and his colleagues. The high priest questions Jesus. Jesus keeps silent or gives an evasive answer. One way or the other, though, they know his claim to be God's son. At least one Judean officer or servant strikes Jesus, apparently in the high priest's presence. In Mark, it's generalized, maybe a generalizing plural. Probably there were other people involved, but John has a particular one striking him. John doesn't report Jesus' response about his identity, the high priest, but Mark's "I am" might appear instead of Jesus' "I am" response to those who came to arrest him in John 18, 5 and 6. Maybe instead, or maybe they're just choosing one place to say it. Peter denies Jesus. Peter follows Jesus from afar in both lines of material. He enters the high priest's courtyard. Peter's warming himself in the high priest's courtyard. Peter, confronted by a servant woman, denies Jesus. Confronted by others, Peter denies Jesus a total of 3 times. The rooster crows during Peter's final denial. Again, all of this is to say, yeah, there are differences between these, but look how much overlap we have. This is not the kind of overlap you expect if somebody is just writing a novel, making up something. This is the kind of overlap you expect where somebody feels a responsibility to have historical information, to have actual information in their material, however they may be preaching it. Jesus before Pilate. You have members of the elite priesthood handing Jesus over to Pilate, apparently on the charge of sedition, king of the Jews. Pilate, the governor, isn't persuaded that Jesus is really a threat. In fact, I think in John's gospel, there's more of it gives us a fuller explanation of something that makes this plausible, why the governor wasn't persuaded. Jesus answers Pilate somewhat ambivalently and then refuses to answer further. Well, John's interpretation of Pilate's ambivalence, I think, offers a plausible approach because Jesus talks about a kingdom that involves truth, and his servants won't fight because it's not the other kind of kingdom. I think that Pilate, coming from a Gentile context, would think in terms of these apolitical, mostly apolitical, or anti-political is probably a better way to put it, street philosophers known as cynics. They and some other sages talked a lot about truth. They talked about who really could have the right to rule, who would really be a good king. And so, as far as Pilate's concerned, Jesus sounds like a harmless cynic sage, or maybe some other kind of sage who's got a kingdom in his head, but it's not a kingdom that's any threat to the Roman Empire. Pilate offers to release Jesus, but the crowds choose Barabbas instead. There's a local paschal amnesty practice that's attested both in Mark and in John. Some people say, well, we don't have any attestation of this practice. That's true. We have no specific attestation of this practice in Judea. We don't have a whole lot of information about those kind of things in Judea. We certainly don't have record books of Pilate or anything like that. But we do have plenty of analogies from the ancient world showing us that these kind of things were sometimes done. So it depends on, where you're going to put the burden of proof. But Pilate offers to release Jesus. The elite priests request or urge the crowd to request Barabbas. And then Pilate has Jesus scourged. Gentile soldiers go on to mock Jesus. They place a crown of thorns on his head. They drape a purple robe on him, and they offer a mock acclamation. Hail, King of the Jews. The crucifixion. Jesus is marched to Golgotha, the place of the skull. Jesus is crucified between two others. The title on Jesus' cross reads King of the Jews. The execution squad divides Jesus' garments. A soldier raises a sponge of sour wine to Jesus' mouth. Mary Magdalene, another Mary, and other women were at the cross. Jesus dies, and he dies more quickly than was typical. Joseph of Arimathea, again, appears in both kinds of source. And if you're going to make up something, why would you make up Arimathea? It's probably Ramathaim, probably the village noted in 1 Samuel chapter 1. But, especially with this name, it's not a name that certainly anybody in the diaspora would be familiar with. It's probably a small village. That's where he's from. It's too obscure for somebody to have had any reason to invent. Joseph requests Jesus's body from Pilate. Joseph then lays Jesus' body in a tomb. The anointing couldn't be completed because it was the preparation day before the Sabbath. And then followers experience the empty tomb and the risen Christ. Mary Magdalene and others come to the tomb in the vicinity of Jerusalem early on or soon after the Sabbath. Remember, the Sabbath is what we would call Friday sundown to Saturday sundown. So what we would call Saturday night, the Sabbath is over, but it's too dark for them to come. So they come in early morning before dawn, but at first light. The sun hasn't peaked up yet over the horizon, but you're still getting enough light that it's safer than going in complete darkness. So they come early on or soon after the Sabbath. At some point, and not early on or soon after, but early on and soon after the Sabbath, at some point they see angels, although Mark says it's a young man, but you can tell by the nature of the description in light of his Jewish context. And when I say Mark has a Jewish context, you look at all his marked citations from the Old Testament. Mark has a Jewish background. He's not as thoroughly immersed in Scripture, trying to communicate it on the level, say, that Matthew is, but Mark takes for granted some knowledge of Scripture, apparently. And so they see angels, and they, or at least Mary, sees Jesus in both John and the Synoptics. Mary or the women are sent with a message, and or the women are sent with the message, and or report their experience. Peter runs and finds the tomb empty, but does not yet see Jesus. Now, this is really noteworthy in these resurrection appearance narratives, because after you get to verse 8 of Mark 16, apparently Matthew and Luke, they would have to go their own way, and John does as well. They can't follow Mark after that, because Mark didn't feel a need to give the resurrection appearances. His climax is the cross. He's going to report the empty tomb. Mark revels in obscurity and parables and riddles. So you've got the empty tomb, you've got the angel saying there are going to be resurrection experiences. Jesus had said he was going to meet his disciples in Galilee. His other prophecies so far have been fulfilled. You can expect this is going to be fulfilled too. Mark doesn't feel the need to narrate those experiences, but we know of them from 1 Corinthians 15. So there were probably plenty of witnesses, plenty of stories. And if you don't have Mark to follow, you may choose some different stories. But even though that's the case, you've got plenty of overlap on some of these matters. Risen Jesus Jesus suddenly stands among the disciples and greets them with the peace blessing. Shalom, in the plural, shalom aleichem, shalom laka, if it's just one person. Peace be with you. Of course, in an Old Testament context, it means may it be well with you. It's a, it's like God bless you, meant literally. Some do not believe, and you have that in Matthew and Luke and in John, where you get a more specific explanation. One of those some who didn't believe was Thomas, and actually some of the others didn't believe initially either. Didn't believe the report of the women. We know that from Luke. And Mark 16:9 through 20, I think that's probably from the 2nd century, so I'm not going to count that. But some of them, or at least the unbeliever, after seeing him, Thomas, they worship Jesus as divine. Jesus invites the disciples to touch him, recognizing his hands, and the disciples rejoice. Of course, even if it hadn't told us that, we probably would infer that, but they do tell us that, both Luke and John. And Jesus' resurrection fulfills the scriptures. And that's something that is, that's a theological interpretation of the event that goes back to the very beginning. You have a commissioning and you have an ascension. Jesus commissions disciples in Matthew 28, Luke 24, and John chapter 20, and then again in Acts chapter 1. And he does so in connection with the promise of the Spirit. So power from on high, Luke 24, power of the Spirit, Acts 1:8. John 15, he gives some of that in advance, but then in John 20, receive the Holy Spirit. And you have it, I think, implied also in advance in Mark, and also in Matthew 28, I'll be with you always until the end of the age. I think that's implying the presence of the Spirit. And Jesus will ultimately ascend. John chapter 20, verse 17, stop holding on to me. At least that's how it can be translated. Hapto, we often translate that as touch, but, let go of me. I haven't ascended to my Father yet, is another way to interpret that. Luke 24 describes the ascension, so does Acts 1, and you have it mentioned. Well, you have it mentioned in Hebrews, and you have the implication of it in 1 Peter 3, in Romans chapter 8, in Ephesians chapter 1, in Colossians chapter, all the places where it says that Jesus is enthroned or seated at the Father's right hand. Somehow he got from being on earth to being there, so you have an ascension kind of implied, although Luke is more graphic in terms of presenting it in spatial terms. Now, how close to the material is John's gospel? Well, John 13:23, one of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. So this would be the person to the right who could lean back his head on Jesus' kolpon, his chest. John 19:26, Jesus entrusts his mother to this disciple. So this is clearly somebody close to him. The families may be close. Although in John chapter 7, like in Mark chapter 3, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but that's another parallel where his brothers don't really believe in him at that point. Although we know from Galatians and 1 Corinthians 15 that that changed. John 19:34 and 35, the beloved disciple is there at the cross to witness this. Now, Mark says that it was just the women. But again, remember what Mark wants to emphasize about the male disciples as, failures at the cross. So if one of them showed up, that wouldn't invalidate Mark's way of putting it. Yeah, just pretty much the women, the disciples were all in hiding. John chapter 20 and verse 2, and this could be especially the case if John is still pretty young, although all the disciples were probably fairly young. They probably all probably most of them were teenagers. But John may have been on the younger end of that. John chapter 20, the disciple runs with Peter to the tomb. Peter has his own resurrection appearance, but John runs with Peter to the tomb. And also in John chapter 21, we have this beloved disciple at this appearance, which, he can be an eyewitness to report this, assuming that John 21 is part of the original gospel, which I do believe it is. And then in John 21:24, this is the disciple who's testifying to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true. That's often considered a post-Johannine colophon, that is, not written by John himself, but John 21:24 and 25 are added by one of the beloved disciples, saying, okay, this all goes back. We're using the material from the beloved disciple. At the risk of taking a rather idiosyncratic position in terms of it's not very widely held, it does seem to me that the beloved disciple doesn't mind describing himself in third person. As that's the case. I mean, you look through ancient historians and ancient biographers, that was pretty common, to describe oneself in the third person, and sometimes to describe oneself in the first person and in the third person in the same book. So, it may be the beloved disciple himself claiming his authorship, but if not, then, I think the most common view is that it's a disciple of the beloved disciple. It's somebody from the Johannine circle who's saying, we got this stuff from the beloved disciple, who actually was an eyewitness. Now, First John is written in the same style as John's gospel. And this is a minority opinion today. I don't understand why it's a minority opinion today that they would be by the same author. And I say that having studied with Moody Smith. He was writing his commentary in the Johannine epistles. I was his teaching assistant, and he had me read over it and respond to some of his arguments in there. And when he argued that there were different authors for John and First John, and he noted the differences, I responded to those and gave my reasons for thinking why actually those are not very big differences. Look at the similarities. I mean, the kind of differences are the kind of differences you have between one part of John's gospel and another part of John's gospel. And he was very gracious. He took those into account. He still held his view, but he's very, very nuanced in the way he expresses it in his commentary. But up until the 20th century, everybody pretty much assumed that they were the same author. The style is so close, but you don't write a gospel the same way you write a letter. And you don't have to be as careful stylistically with a letter as you do with the gospel. With a gospel, a biography, something that long, that's meant to be a foundation document, as Charles Talbot calls it, for community, you're going to probably go through more than one draft, at least orally, and probably even in writing for something that's meant to be that important. Mark's gospel may not have been through both drafts in writing, we don't know. But John's gospel probably made it through more than one draft. I don't hold the redactional stages that Raymond Brown came up with in his Community, the Beloved Disciple. They were brilliant, but I think it's too speculative. But probably there were stages in editing, even if we can't reconstruct them, because probably there was more than one draft. And we don't know if some of his disciples, John's disciples, cleaned it up afterwards. That's a common view. Actually, I talked with Alan Culpepper about this, and he's argued for the Johannine circle. That's Coleman's language. The Johannine school, John's own immediate disciples, were probably the ones who put together the Gospel of John based on the eyewitness material of the beloved disciple. And that's a respectable thesis, but I still think, and I argue for, I don't know, 30 pages, 60 pages, something like that in my John commentary for John being the author. That's, by the way, I should tell you, that's an extreme minority view in the sense there are others who've argued that it goes back to an eyewitness. So James Charlesworth has argued for Thomas. Of course, Richard Bauckham, Martin Hengel, and a number of others have argued for the author being another John, who seems to be mentioned in tradition. Papias talks about, well, Eusebius interprets Papias as talking about two Johns. When I actually read what Eusebius's quotation of Papias, it looks to me personally like there's just one John there who happened to outlive the other apostles and is an elder, but he's also the same as one of the original apostles. So that's a matter for dispute. But there are a few of us who think that John actually is the author, including Andres Kostenberger and pretty sure, yeah, Craig Blomberg. And there's a really, really well-known scholar, but he said this, and he's not known as an evangelical scholar, but he's a really top-notch scholar, but I haven't asked his permission to make it public because he told me in private that he thought it was a really good case, but I don't know that he's published it, so I'll leave him anonymous. But there are a handful of us, at least, who think this. But whoever the author is, I think personally, stylistically, it makes sense that this is the same person. And that when in 1 John 1, he speaks of we touched him, he's not just speaking for we, the community, he's speaking of we, the eyewitnesses. We declare to you what was from the beginning, what we've heard, what we've seen with our eyes, what we looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life. Sounds like kind of like John 1:14, we beheld his glory. And we are writing these things so that so that our joy may be complete. Sometimes he uses the we inclusively, sometimes he uses it for a narrower group exclusively in John's gospel. Now, first century gospels in general they're very different from later fictitious gospels in this respect. The names and the geography and the customs in the first century gospel, where we can test them, because we can't test everything. I mean, again, it's 2,000 years later, but where we can test them, they fit pretty well. First century Judea and Galilee, they don't fit the diaspora, or sometimes they fit both, but I mean, we don't have places where they only fit the diaspora, or we have, and you know, sometimes often they fit the Old Testament, but sometimes when it's not something that could just be extrapolated from the Old Testament or from Jewish practice everywhere, where it's different from that, normally it's something that you have in Judea and Galilee. Now, sometimes they'll change that for their audience. So for instance, Luke may speak of roof tiles for the place where the paralytic is let down in Luke 5:19, as opposed to in Mark chapter 2, where they tear up the roof. And you know, he's updating it for his audience. So you can expect a few of those, but we've got a whole lot of echoes of material that clearly goes back before that, material that needs to go back to memories of people who actually lived in first century Galilee. And we could talk about, well, let me talk about just a few more of those, and that way we can have a clean break at the break. But names and geography. So onomastics, Richard Bauckham has done a lot with this, following up on some onomastic work by some other scholars. But the names fit first century Judea and Galilee. They don't fit the diaspora. So Simon, James or Jacob and Judah were among the most common male names of this period. Not surprisingly, you've got a couple disciples named Simon, a couple disciples named, we say James, but really Jacob, Yaakov or Jacobus, and a couple named Judas or Judah. And for that reason, they have to be distinguished in certain ways. You could distinguish people using patronymics or nicknames, and these have these kind of distinguishing names. That was a common practice. In fact, in the papyri, you find a lot of people who have double or even triple names to identify them. The most common women's names were Mary and Salome. We have one Salome in the Gospels who's named as such, but Miriam or Mary, that's a really common name in the Gospels, and not surprisingly, that was the most common woman's name in that period. Now, you wouldn't expect to find the tomb of, say, Simon Peter, especially you wouldn't expect to find that in Judea since he probably died in Rome. There are traditions that you would find that. So let me pick a different example. You wouldn't expect to find the tomb of somebody who was not important politically or wealthy. Most tombs from antiquity have not survived. Most tombs that have survived, we don't actually know the names of all the people buried in them. But with more prominent personages, we sometimes have better remaining physical attestation. So for Caiaphas, we have actually his ossuary, most likely, his bone box, where the name is attested on the ossuary. There's actually more than one set of bones, but the one of them was an older man, probably, or the bones of the high priest Caiaphas. And the Roman governor, of course, is well known. Although Pilate appears only once in Roman literature in Tacitus's Annals 1544, he appears in Josephus, he appears in Philo, but in terms of physical attestation, he did mint coins, but in terms of physical attestation, we have also an inscription that happens to attest him, which is pretty good because there were a lot of ancient governors we have no attestation for, but we do happen to have it in the case of Pilate. In terms of locations, when they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the Praetorium, and again, these pictures are thanks to Todd Bolin and his Bible places where you can get pictures like this as well. This is Herod's palace on the Jerusalem model. And we're pretty sure, based on Josephus and other material, that this is where Jesus' trial would have taken place before Pilate. Pilate probably didn't stay in the Fortress Antonia. That was the older tradition. The pavement, the Gabbatha, they used to think that was a certain place in the Antonia. But today it's pretty widely agreed that rather the real place was Herod's palace. The Fortress Antonia is on I think it's the north end of the Temple Mount. I'm saying I know where it is on my map. I'm just assuming my map has north on the top. Here's Herod's palace in a public square in the Jerusalem model. And here again is Herod's palace in the Jerusalem model. And here is where it would be located if you were looking at it in modern Jerusalem, some of the remains. Also, Jesus comes from Nazareth. Scholars, I think the only scholars who really deny that Jesus came from Nazareth are the Jesus mythers, who deny Jesus altogether, because who's going to make up a Nazareth? Like Nathaniel said, can anything good come out of Nazareth? As far as we can tell from the archaeological excavations, it had only a couple hundred people. And if it were depending just on the excavations, it might have even fewer than that. But if it's too much fewer, then you wouldn't expect anybody to have heard of it. But it was at least big enough, and it was traditional and orthodox enough. So them wanting to throw Jesus off this hill is not too too surprising in terms of tradition. Those of you who have ministered in certain kinds of small churches may be familiar with tradition, but traditional and orthodox enough that the priests settled there after 70, when the temple was destroyed and the priesthood was scattered. You had the 24 courses of priests. Well, they found an inscription that lists the 24 courses of priests, or as much of it as survives, and the places where they settled after the year 70, and Nazareth was one of them. Nazareth also fits Jesus's profession as the carpenter. Sepphoris was just an hour or two's walk from Nazareth. And Sepphoris burned down in the tax revolt in 4 BC. Immediately, Herod Antipas, the tetrarch of Galilee, set to rebuilding it. And that meant that during Jesus' childhood, well, one job that was really needed in nearby Sepphoris for people who lived or stayed in Nazareth was carpentry. They need stonemasons, they need some woodworkers. Oh, wow. I don't know why my slide says carpenters more the latter. Matt has disabused me of that notion. It can actually be either one. But in any case, many in Judea worked on Herod's temple and became unemployed afterwards. So we don't know. There may have been a lot of unemployed carpenters once Sepphoris was rebuilt. But apparently Jesus was known as the carpenter, and Joseph was known as the carpenter. So we're talking about a family that was apparently pretty skilled at this, very good at it. A small community like Nazareth might have just one carpenter or family of carpenters. Here's a photograph of Joseph. No, not really. He probably had a beard back then. Artisans often apprenticed their sons. So again, no surprise that we read about in Matthew the carpenter's son, whereas we read in Mark about the carpenter. And early Pharisaic teachers, insofar as we have them documented from the earliest layer of rabbinic tradition, many of them worked in trades. Shammai reportedly worked as a carpenter. Chorazin, virtually unheard of outside Galilee. Nobody's going to make that up, but you have it in the Q material, again suggesting information from a Galilean or Galileans. Here's some of the remains from its synagogue facade. I think this may be later than 1st century, not sure. Some other synagogue remains in Chorazin. Bethsaida, they came to Bethsaida. In Mark, John says Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. It's a fishing community not too far from Capernaum. Andrew and Peter may have been, it may mean that they grew up there, even though they now live in Capernaum, or it may mean that they had residences in both places. They weren't that far apart if you're going by your fishing boats. So maybe certain seasons they'd be fishing more in one site than another. Of course, the sardines are more common at Tagba in I think winter fishing. No, when I'm diverging from my slides and I'm going from memory, I may be mistaken on some of these details. So feel free to look the things up if you're not sure if I'm right, because I'm not always sure I'm right. But the fishing community of Bethsaida was not too far from Capernaum, and fishing instruments have been found at Et Tel, which is what the current majority of scholars think is the site of Bethsaida. There is, as we've mentioned before, another possible site. Josephus tells us that at a certain point that scholars often reconstruct as around the year 30, the site of Bethsaida was renamed. Now, the old name could still be used, but the new name was the dominant name, Julius. So after the year 30, the site would often be named Julius and often be called Julius as well as Bethsaida. But in the Gospels, it's consistently named only as Bethsaida, which means that it's reporting the memory of somebody from Galilee, from around the year 30 or earlier. Here's an aerial view of Etel. And again, other major fishing villages in the vicinity, barely known outside of Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. One major center for salting, fishing, and distributing was Magdala, also known as Terache, where Mary Magdalene was from. And along with Lake of Galilee towns such as Capernaum and Bethsaida, this was heavily involved in the fish trade. Fishing utensils also been found in Capernaum, but the fishing industry was dominant at Capernaum and Bethsaida. Later novelists, somebody who's just making things up, wouldn't know that. And novelists back then, unlike many historical novelists today, rarely did any research. It's like, Acts chapters 13 and 14 happening in the interior of Asia. Those aren't things that novelists would have gone into the interior of Asia to research. Those are much less frequently frequented communities. Unsurprisingly, some of Jesus' disciples, given the locations, given the geography, the topography, some of Jesus' disciples were fishermen. No reason for anybody to make that up. You're going to make something up. They'd be scribes, they'd be priests, something like that. But it fits the environs of Jesus' ministry. They found a first century fishing boat, the remains of it. Obviously, it was in better shape back then. And Capernaum also would not have been invented. It was just like 10 to 12 acres, maybe 1,000 to 2,000 people. Some people think it's less. Medium-sized fishing and agricultural village, big fishing industry. Apparently had a tax or custom station, which fits what we read about tax collectors, especially Levi or Matthew, whether you're looking at Mark 2 or Matthew 9. And the synagogue, Peter's house is not far, well, what's thought to be Peter's house is not far from the synagogue. Capernaum's harbor. In Jesus' day, the Lake of Galilee was almost 700 feet below sea level. And in a drought a few decades ago, the Lake of Galilee was a lot lower, so they were able to explore a number of the ancient harbors. And the first century harbor of Capernaum, again, definitely a fishing village, was about 2,500 feet long and had piers extending roughly 100 feet into the lake. Winter fishing, yes, Tabga, about 2 miles south of Capernaum. There were warm springs that entered there, and it drew many mushed in winter and spring. Earlier I said sardines. Mendel Nun, who was the primary source for this, the main original researcher, at the high point of the mushed season, a trammel net can catch 100 to 200 pounds of fish in a night. And if too many fish, the whole net would be pulled into the boat first. Capernaum synagogue, the first century black basalt synagogue, almost certainly a synagogue because this is public space, community center, that would be a synagogue. And it didn't make sense to build this later, nice, beautiful, monumental synagogue on top of a latrine or something like that. It had to be a pure space. And also it's built on a slope. It wouldn't make sense for the building unless they're building on something important beneath it, which also happens to be very large, which in a village like Capernaum, probably that means it was important space. So the black basalt remains underneath it are probably the original synagogue. Now, in terms of Jesus and his disciples going to Peter's house after being there, as you have in Mark chapter 1, well, you can see the synagogue from Peter's house. There may be some things in the way in between, but as far as it being Peter's house, fishing instruments have been found there, not surprising in a fishing community, but also early Christian graffiti and the early expansion of living quarters into a meeting place which not competing with the synagogue or not trying to be the synagogue may mean it was a house church. The Talmud also attests a Christian presence in Capernaum, so that part isn't disputed, but that this probably grew from Peter's own house. There's a good chance of that. And at this point, I need to give you a 10-minute break. And so I am going to stop my share, and we'll be able to have more conversation, more feedback, and as we come back from the break. And we can converse about this if you've taken notes on it. And we probably should stop the recording though. And